Chapter 24. A Good Harvest. Remember to be gentle with yourself and others. We are all children of chance, and none can say why some fields will blossom while others lay brown beneath the August sun. Care for those around you. Look past your differences. Their dreams are no less than yours, their choices no more easily made. And give in any way that you can, of whatever you possess. To give is to love, to withhold is to wither. Care less for your harvest than for how it is shared, and your life will have meaning, and your heart will have peace. Kent Nurburn. Fine-boned fingers covered his eyes. The smell of freshly turned dirt and the mint she had been picking filled his nose. "Guess who?" Chris smiled. "Hey, Liza, making mint tea?" Carrie's sister let out a disappointed sniff. "You knew it was me." "Of course I did. You smell different than Carrie." He didn't tell her that Carrie had this indescribable scent, this earthly combination of sage and wood smoke that was almost drug-like. It pulled him in and made him want to get closer, wrap his arms around her and never let go. Liza smelled good too, but she smelled of childhood and cinnamon. He couldn't explain it any better than that. In the past few weeks, Liza's attitude toward him and towards her sister had begun to alter. She kept seeking him out when the others were busy with tasks, and whenever Carrie and he were together, she picked fights and argued with her sister endlessly. It had taken him a while, but he had come to suspect that Liza had a crush. She would be 14 in just a few months, and she was acting as if Carrie was more a rival than a sister. Carrie was confused by the behavior, commenting to Chris in private that they had always been close and rarely fought like other siblings. "I just don't know what's with Liza these days. Everything I say or do is wrong." Carrie nibbled her thumbnail. "It's almost as if she is dying to pick a fight with me. But why?" Chris had caught Liza spying on them twice now. They still hadn't gone all the way, but they were getting close, and he was worried that things were coming to a head. He had to deal with it, somehow. He looked up at Liza, who was staring down at him with a confused, half-hopeful smile. Crap. He set down the basket of tomatoes he had been picking. It was nearly full, the red and orange fruits firm and beautiful, promising to explode with juice the instant they were cut into. He figured he had 3 more baskets to pick before he would be done for the day. "Liza, we need to talk." She grinned happily. "Did you finish Voyage from Yesteryear already? I just left it by your door 2 days ago." He shook his head and her expression turned from excited to guarded. "No, I haven't finished reading it yet, but it's good." He smiled at her. "I had a hard time putting it down this morning and getting to work." He pointed to the raised planters and the tomato cages. "Help me pick more?" "Sure." As they fell into a rhythm, he got up the courage to say what was on his mind. "You know, Liza, you're a very pretty girl." He saw her hand pause, almost drop the tomato she was holding. "I know you like me, and really, I'm flattered, I am." He met her eyes then. She looked afraid. "But You're in love with Carrie." "Yeah, I am. I want to marry her." Her chin dropped to her chest, and he thought he saw a small tear fall to the ground. "Liza, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't make it any better, but really I am, 'cause you are a really cool chick, and you love sci-fi, which totally kicks ass." That elicited a small, wet giggle. "I want us to be friends, and if your granddad doesn't shoot me first, someday I'd like to be your brother." Liza looked up at him, her eyes wet with tears. Why do you have to be so damn nice, Chris? Couldn't you just say, 'Buzz off, kid, your sister's way hotter than you'?" It was his turn to look away. He hated to see the kid cry. "Sorry, Liza. That's just how I'm wired, I guess. And besides, you aren't a kid anymore, and you are hot. Or did you miss the way Carl Owens stared at you all last week? He didn't dare tell her how much she reminded him of Jess when she was a high school freshman. It was painful to look at her sometimes. Just thinking about Jess now, imagining how she had died, made him want to scream. He hadn't protected her, but he would protect Carrie and Liza, Joseph and Fenton with his dying breath. He couldn't bring back what he had lost, but he could make sure he didn't lose anything more. Lost in his thoughts, he was surprised when Liza wrapped her arms around him. He hugged her back, hoping he was doing the right thing, and she kissed him lightly on the cheek. Before he could react, she had bounded away, heading for some quiet corner to compose herself. He visibly jumped when Carrie's voice spoke from behind him. "So that's what was going on these past few weeks?" Chris whirled around to face her. "That's why she's been so pissy. She likes you?" She seemed blown away by this fact. He smiled at her. "Is it so hard to believe?" "Well, no." She stood there with a peculiar smile on her face. "Well, then what are you smiling about?" He was feeling a bit defensive. After all, he'd tried to be nice about it, and the kid had still run off crying. "I'm thinking that you are really, really sweet." Carrie stepped forward, put a hand on each side of his face, and kissed him softly. "You saw it when I didn't. You made her feel cared for even if she couldn't have you. Thank you for that." "You aren't pissed off because I hugged her and she kissed me?" He couldn't believe his luck. A beautiful, sexy girl who wasn't crazy with jealousy? She shook her head wordlessly and kissed him again, this time with promise and intent. He kissed her back, ran his hands down her back, and slid his hands over her short shorts. The kiss was intense, passionate. Unfortunately, it was cut short by a shout for help from Fenton. The shout came from the barn where Fenton had been tinkering with the truck for the past week now. The carburetor had been a relatively easy fix, but the huge dent that Liza had put into the front fender when she ran it into a fence while learning to drive had caused significant damage. The Chiltons' manual they had found in town was getting its fair share of use as Fenton paged through it, uttering long-winded complaints about the dangers of teenage drivers. His yell brought everyone running. This was a good thing, since he seemed determined to bleed to death from a large gash on his forehead. Blood streaked down his face, and Liza beat the rest of them to the barn, arriving at her grandfather's side first. Her face still showed signs of tears, but no one noticed. Chris pulled off his shirt and used it to apply pressure to the wound. "Jesus, Gramps." Carrie helped her grandfather to a seated position on an old tire. "What happened?" Fenton gave her an irritated look. "Young lady, you keep using the Lord's name in vain and I'll wash your mouth out with soap. By damn, I can't even see out of this eye." His right eye was covered in blood, which had alarmed Chris until he realized it was merely flowing from the wound above. "I managed to walk into the shelf over there." He gestured at a shelf that had been mounted on the wall and stacked with boxes of screws. It was now hanging precariously from one end, and all of the screws were in a jumble of broken boxes on the floor. Liza examined the wound. "Head wounds bleed a lot, but this is a deep gash. Good one, Gramps." He grimaced at her. "We had better clean it up and put in some stitches." Liza spent time studying medical texts when she wasn't reading science fiction. It made sense for at least one person to know medicine, especially in these times, and Fenton and Carrie had both encouraged her studies by trading eggs and live chicks for 2 medical textbooks. Liza had begun studying in earnest the year after her mother's death. She had even helped Fenton set Chris's ankle when he had first arrived, and even corrected his technique when they wrapped and then splinted it. Currently, she was working her way through a thick manual on obstetrics. Chris had seen one of the pictures and felt his stomach roil. Definitely not his cup of tea. "Can you make Gramps better, sis?" Joseph asked. The kid looked scared. Liza paused in her examination to smile at her little brother. "I sure can, Joseph. Gramps is going to be just fine. Let's get him back to the house, and then we'll fix him up better than ever." She turned back to Fenton, and the three of them hoisted him to his feet. In the end, the couple of stitches had been 10 perfect little sutures. Fenton insisted on several healthy swigs from a full bottle of Jack Daniels hidden deep on a high shelf. Chris retrieved it and smiled. He could see 10 other bottles of hard liquor, all unopened. He figured old Fenton had put them up there about 3 years ago, about the time the girls and their mother had arrived and hadn't touched them since. "That there needle is gonna hurt," Fenton had given his way of explanation. "I plan on making it hurt less." He had still had a few choice things to say during the procedure. Carrie started canning the tomatoes Chris already picked. He picked the rest while she worked over the stove, blanching, peeling, and preparing the tomatoes. This task lasted late into the night. They lit a gas lamp to see by and kept working on the pile of tomatoes. As they worked, they listened to Fenton sing, quite drunkenly now that nearly half the bottle of whiskey was gone. When in his cups, Fenton seemed overly fond of Elvis Presley. The tomatoes were all canned. Jars lined every piece of available countertop. Joseph was curled in a small ball on the couch, and Fenton was launching into the 5th rendition of "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog" when Liza took the bottle out of his hand and handed it to Chris. She rolled her eyes at him, suppressing a smile, and nodded to the high shelf. She and Carrie each took a side and gently pulled Fenton to his feet. They guided him slowly up the stairs to his room. Chris returned the bottle to the shelf and took a moment to look over what else was up there. The old man had quite a selection. The warm hand that ran up his leg quickly changed its focus. The thought that came next was shocking in its simplicity. "What are you waiting for?" He climbed down the counter and turned to face Carrie. The moon had risen in the sky, and the light from it poured in the kitchen window. He leaned over, blew out the lamp, and pulled her close. She felt the change in him and responded in kind, shivering slightly as his lips found her neck and worked their way up to her right ear. He whispered in it, "Let's go for a walk." He felt rather than saw her nod. He grabbed several blankets, spread one over little Joseph, and the other 2 he tucked under his arm. Quietly, they slipped out of the door, closing it quietly behind them. Hand in hand, they walked. They didn't discuss it, and their feet carried them unerringly to the old farmstead. It was their special place. They had been slipping away for make-out sessions there as often as possible in the last few months. He carefully spread the blanket out, and they lay down side by side. The stars were incredibly bright and beautiful. It was warm, and all around them the night pulsed with life, thousands of tiny creatures attending to their nocturnal activities. They took notice of the 2 humans in their midst and shied away, creating a bubble of space around the couple. As they watched a satellite slowly make its way across the sky, Chris wondered if the space station was still up there, and if there were any astronauts inside. If there were, and if the rest of the world was in as bad of shape as the U.S. was, they were nothing but frozen skeletons by now. He pushed those thoughts out of his mind and thought instead of how amazing Carrie smelled, even with the scent of tomatoes clinging to her. He reached down and took her hand in his. It felt tiny and fragile in comparison with his, but he knew that was an illusion. Carrie was a strong woman in mind and spirit. She knew her mind, and she fought for what she wanted. Here he had a future, a family, and love. He pulled her close and leaned in for a kiss. It heated and went on as their pulses quickened. Their clothing fell in a heap, and the love-making was as gentle as he could make it for her. In the end, he collapsed beside her, burrowed his face into her neck, and kissed her moist skin. All of these months of playing, of dancing about and teasing, and they had finally gone and done it. At least he knew Fenton wasn't busy cleaning his shotgun right now. The minutes ticked by and Chris pulled part of the thin blanket over them. He could hear Carrie's breathing settle and even out. "Carrie?" He jostled her. "Wake up." "I'm awake." He pulled himself to one elbow and looked into her face. He could see it clearly in the moonlight. Her eyes were open, and she had a satisfied, almost smug smile. He reached out and smoothed a lock of hair back behind her left ear. "I love you, Carrie Lynn Perdue. Will you marry me?" She smiled even wider, put her hands on both sides of his face. "I love you too, Christopher Michael Aronson. And yes, I will marry you." What followed was a good deal more of what had just occurred. It continued with little sleep through most of that night. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as the two lovers slipped back inside the house.